Settle yourself comfortably, dear listener, and allow the world outside to fade away. Imagine instead a quiet English village where time appears to move just a little more slowly, and where the greatest disturbances are usually a misplaced teacup or an overgrown hedge. Such places pride themselves on order, on tradition, on the comforting belief that nothing truly dreadful could ever happen there. And yet Miss Jane Marple has learned, through long observation and a lifetime of quiet listening, that evil does not announce itself loudly. It prefers familiarity, respectability, the cover of polite smiles and well-kept lawns. Hawthorne Manor stood as a symbol of all that was proper and enduring. Its stone walls had witnessed generations of family gatherings, whispered disputes, and carefully guarded secrets. To the villagers of St. Mary Mead, it was simply the manor, a place of afternoon visits, summer fetes, and unspoken hierarchies. Until one morning, when a single death shattered that illusion. At first, the explanation seemed simple enough: a fall, a tragic accident, the sort of misfortune that could be discussed in lowered voices and eventually laid to rest. But Miss Marple knows better. She knows that accidents, much like people, have habits. And when something feels out of place, when a detail does not sit quite right, it is often because someone has worked very hard to make it seem ordinary. A vase positioned too carefully, a smell that lingers just a moment longer than it should. A family whose grief does not follow the expected pattern. These are the things Miss Marple notices. These are the threads she gently unravels, stitch by stitch, until the truth, however unpleasant, can no longer remain hidden. So listen closely, because within the walls of Hawthorne Manor, amid its quiet corridors and courteous conversations, a murderer believes themselves safe. And they have made one very serious mistake. They have underestimated Miss Marple. Chapter 1. The Death at Hawthorne Manor. Hawthorne Manor had always possessed a certain restrained dignity. It was not ostentatious, nor was it modest. It stood exactly where it believed it ought to stand, slightly elevated above the village road, surrounded by clipped hedges and ancient oak trees that whispered softly when the wind passed through them. For generations, the Whitcomb family had lived within its stone walls, cultivating an image of respectability that was rarely questioned and never challenged. On the morning Charles Whitcomb died, the manor was unnaturally still. Miss Marple sensed it the moment she stepped from the hired car onto the gravel drive. There was no welcoming bustle, no sound of domestic routine drifting through open windows. Even the birds seemed hesitant, their calls sporadic and subdued. She adjusted her gloves and walked slowly toward the front door. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, thick with something unspoken. The entrance hall smelled faintly of flowers and polish, yet beneath it lingered a sharper note, almost medicinal. Miss Marple's keen nose registered it at once, though she did not yet allow herself to draw conclusions. At the foot of the staircase lay Charles Whitcomb. He was positioned awkwardly, as though his body had lost its balance mid-movement and simply given up. One leg was twisted beneath him. His head rested at an unnatural angle. Nearby, a porcelain vase lay shattered, water spreading across the polished wood floor in a slow, deliberate creep. Inspector Graves straightened as Miss Marple approached. "Terrible business," he said, his voice carrying the brisk efficiency of a man who preferred facts neat and tidy. "Slipped on the stairs, hit his head. Doctor confirms death was instantaneous." Miss Marple nodded politely but did not answer. Instead, she looked at the stairs. They were broad, shallow, and well-maintained. The carpet runner was secure, its edges neatly tacked. No sign of fraying, no loose steps, no obvious hazard. She looked at the vase next. Fresh flowers, carefully arranged, positioned just so, as though someone had wanted it to be noticed. Miss Marple had known many houses like this. Houses where objects were placed with intention, not carelessness. "Who found him?" she asked gently. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb stepped forward, clutching her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "I did," she said. Her voice trembled, but her eyes remained dry. "I was coming down for breakfast when I heard the crash." "And you touched nothing?" Inspector Graves asked. "No," she said quickly. Too quickly, Miss Marple thought. Around them the household had gathered. Lydia Whitcomb, Charles's wife, stood near the doorway, her face composed to the point of rigidity. Not a tear disturbed her carefully powdered cheeks. Her gloved hands were clasped tightly together, knuckles white. Mr. Alfred Pritchard, the family secretary, lingered a little apart from the others. His eyes moved constantly, taking in the inspector, the servants, the body itself, as though cataloging information for later use. Then there was Clara Whitcomb. She sat on a low chair near the wall, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the stairs. She did not cry, she did not speak, but her stillness was not calm, it was watchful. Miss Marple moved closer to the body, lowering herself carefully to examine it more closely. Charles's lips held a faint bluish tint, subtle, easily dismissed. But Miss Marple had seen it before, in another village, another house, another accident. She inhaled discreetly. There it was again, that faint, bitter note, almost like almonds. "Has anyone touched the vase?" Miss Marple asked. Lydia Whitcomb answered this time. "It was there last night," she said. "Charles insisted on having fresh flowers. He was particular." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Yes, some people are." She rose slowly to her feet. "If you will forgive me," she said to Inspector Graves, "I should very much like a cup of tea." The inspector blinked. "Tea?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "One often thinks better with a cup of tea." In the drawing-room, as tea was poured with trembling hands, Miss Marple observed quietly. No one spoke of grief. They spoke instead of schedules, of inconvenience, of the unpleasantness of police inquiries. Mrs. Whitcomb worried aloud about reputation. Mr. Pritchard mentioned legal matters, wills, trusts, delays. Only Clara remained silent. Miss Marple watched her carefully. When the tea arrived, Miss Marple stirred hers slowly, then stopped. She did not drink it. "Was Charles feeling unwell last night?" she asked, as though the thought had only just occurred to her. There was a pause, brief but telling. "He complained of a headache," Lydia said at last. "Nothing serious." "Did he take anything for it?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "A powder," Mrs. Whitcomb said, "from the medicine cabinet." Miss Marple nodded. "How unfortunate," she murmured. "So very unfortunate." She glanced toward the cabinet in question, its glass door faintly ajar. In her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that murder often dressed itself as convenience. A powder, a vase, a fall, each element carefully arranged to tell a simple story. But simple stories rarely survived close examination. As Inspector Graves prepared to leave and the household began to disperse, Miss Marple remained seated, her eyes thoughtful. Someone in Hawthorne Manor had wanted Charles Whitcomb dead, and someone else, perhaps more than one, had benefited from it. This was not merely a tragedy. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Call to action. Do you think the death was truly an accident? Or did one small detail convince you otherwise? Share your theory in the comments. Quiet conversations and unspoken motives. By the afternoon, Hawthorne Manor had settled into a strained imitation of normality. Curtains were drawn back, the shattered vase had been swept away, and the faint scent of polish attempted, rather unsuccessfully, to erase the morning's disturbance. Yet for Miss Marple, the house now felt louder than before, not in sound, but in intention. Every glance lingered too long, every movement carried weight. She sat in the small morning room, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her, while the household reorganized itself around the reality of Charles Whitcomb's death. Inspector Graves had departed with assurances that he would return shortly, which Miss Marple knew meant he believed the matter largely concluded. Accidental deaths were comforting things. They required little imagination and even less patience. Miss Marple, however, possessed both. Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb insisted that luncheon be served as usual, though no one seemed hungry. The table was laid with meticulous care, silverware aligned precisely, as though order itself might protect them from unpleasant truths. Miss Marple watched the family as they gathered. Lydia Whitcomb arrived first. She wore a pale blue dress that did not quite suit her complexion, but which she had clearly chosen with care. Her posture was perfect, her expression unreadable. "You must forgive me," Lydia said politely, taking her seat. "It's been a dreadful day." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Such days often reveal more than we expect." Lydia smiled thinly and reached for her napkin. Mrs. Whitcomb followed, her movements brisk and purposeful. Grief, if present, had been replaced by urgency. There were arrangements to be made, letters to send, lawyers to consult. "Charles was always so careless," she said suddenly, as though continuing an earlier conversation. "Always rushing about." Miss Marple looked at her over the rim of her teacup. "Was he?" Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated. "Well, perhaps not rushing, exactly, but he had worries. Anyone would, in his position." "And what position was that?" Miss Marple asked gently. Before Mrs. Whitcomb could answer, Alfred Pritchard entered the room. He carried a slim folder under his arm and moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to managing other people's affairs. He nodded politely to Miss Marple and took a seat at the far end of the table. "If you'll excuse me," he said, "I've been reviewing some documents that may require immediate attention." "Such as?" Miss Marple inquired. Pritchard cleared his throat. "The will." The word settled heavily in the room. Lydia's fingers tightened around her fork. Mrs. Whitcomb's lips pressed together. "Of course," Miss Marple said. "One must always be practical." Pritchard continued, "Charles's death complicates matters. Certain provisions were due to be revised." "Revised?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, there were discussions, nothing finalized." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Discussions have a way of becoming very important, don't they?" No one replied. At the far side of the table, Clara Whitcomb had arrived quietly. She sat with her hands folded, eyes lowered. Miss Marple noticed that she ate nothing. "Clara, dear," Mrs. Whitcomb said sharply, "you must eat something." "I'm not hungry," Clara replied softly. Miss Marple turned her attention fully to the young woman. "You were close to your cousin, were you not?" Clara looked up, startled. "Yes, we spoke often." "About what?" Miss Marple asked. "About leaving," Clara said. then stopped. "Leaving Hawthorne Manor?" Miss Marple prompted. Clara nodded. "Charles wanted to change things. He said the house, the family, had become trapped by expectations." Lydia laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "Charles was always full of ideas." "But ideas can be dangerous," Miss Marple said mildly, "especially when they threaten established arrangements." The conversation drifted after that, but Miss Marple's mind remained alert. Later, as the others dispersed, she found herself alone with Alfred Pritchard in the study. "You managed Charles's affairs?" she asked. "I advised him," Pritchard corrected. "He was resistant to guidance." "Resistance often suggests determination," Miss Marple said. Pritchard stiffened slightly. "He intended to make changes, disruptive ones." "And you disagreed?" "I believed he was mistaken." Miss Marple rose and moved toward the bookshelf, her fingers brushing lightly along the spines. "Mistaken people," she said softly, "are sometimes very inconvenient." Pritchard said nothing. That evening, Miss Marple retired to the small guest room prepared for her. She sat by the window, knitting absently as dusk settled over the grounds. Below, she saw Lydia walking briskly across the lawn toward the garden path. A few minutes later, Alfred Pritchard followed, glancing around before disappearing in the same direction. Miss Marple's needles paused. Private conversations, shared secrets, alignments forming quietly away from watchful eyes. She set her knitting aside. In the silence of the darkening manor, Miss Marple felt the pieces beginning to shift. The fall on the stairs was only the surface of a much deeper design. Charles Whitcomb had intended change. Someone else had intended to stop him. And in Hawthorne Manor, intentions had a habit of becoming fatal. Chapter 2. Call to Action. Which character's behavior seems most suspicious so far, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments. Chapter 3. The Powder in the Cabinet. Miss Marple had always believed that houses remembered things, not in any mystical sense, of course, but in the way objects remained where they were placed, in the way habits shaped rooms, and in how the smallest domestic detail could betray the truth far more reliably than human testimony. The morning after Charles Whitcomb's death, she rose early. Hawthorne Manor was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt deliberate, an enforced calm, carefully maintained. The servants moved softly, exchanging glances but little conversation. Breakfast was laid with almost excessive neatness, as though order itself had become a form of defense. Miss Marple ate very little. Instead, she waited. At precisely 9:30, Mrs. Eleanor Whitcomb excused herself to write letters. Lydia retired to her room with a headache, and Alfred Pritchard announced he would be reviewing papers in the study. The house, Miss Marple observed, had a schedule, and schedules, when disrupted, often revealed more than their keepers intended. She rose quietly and made her way to the corridor outside Charles Whitcomb's former bedroom. The door stood closed, but not locked. Inside, the room was impeccably arranged, too impeccably, Miss Marple thought. A man does not die suddenly and leave no trace of disorder unless someone has tidied for him. Her attention was drawn at once to the small cabinet beside the washstand, the medicine cabinet. She opened it carefully. Inside were several bottles and tins, all neatly labeled: aspirin, sleeping draught, digestive powder, headache powders, and folded paper packets. Miss Marple examined them one by one. The packets were uniform, except for one. This one had been opened recently. The fold was uneven, the paper slightly creased, as though handled more than once. She unfolded it delicately. The powder inside was pale, almost white. Miss Marple brought it close, inhaling very lightly. There it was again, that faint, bitter almond scent. She folded the paper back exactly as she had found it and returned it to the cabinet. Then she stepped back, surveying the room as a whole. Charles Whitcomb had complained of a headache, a perfectly reasonable ailment. A powder would have been offered without suspicion. And if something had been added to that powder, the rest did not require imagination. As she turned to leave, she noticed something else. A faint smudge on the edge of the cabinet door, barely visible, the mark of a thumb. Miss Marple frowned. The servants always wore gloves when handling personal effects. Mrs. Whitcomb prided herself on cleanliness. Lydia rarely touched anything without a handkerchief. But Alfred Pritchard did not wear gloves. Later that morning, Miss Marple encountered Clara Whitcomb in the rose garden. The young woman sat alone on a bench, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, her eyes shadowed but alert. "You're looking for answers," Clara said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied, sitting beside her. "And sometimes answers look for us." Clara hesitated. "Charles was afraid." "Of what?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Of being stopped," Clara said. "He discovered something about the estate, about the trust." "What sort of thing?" Miss Marple pressed. Clara shook her head. "He wouldn't say, only that it involved Mr. Pritchard and Lydia." Miss Marple absorbed this calmly. "And did he intend to act on this discovery?" "Yes, he said he would confront them after dinner." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her mind. After dinner. Headache. Powder. Death. The sequence was beginning to form. That afternoon, Inspector Graves returned. Miss Marple requested a private word and led him discreetly into the small sitting room. "You may wish to reconsider your conclusion," she said, handing him a folded piece of paper. He unfolded it. Inside was a small sample of powder. "You took this from the cabinet?" he asked sharply. "I observed it," Miss Marple corrected, "and I noticed what did not belong." Graves frowned. "Poison?" "I believe so. Something fast-acting. Something that could cause dizziness, a fall." "And the smell?" "Bitter almonds are not a coincidence," Miss Marple said mildly. "One grows accustomed to such things if one pays attention." Graves sighed. "You're suggesting murder." "I am suggesting preparation," Miss Marple replied. "The fall merely completed what the powder began." That evening tension hung thickly over dinner. Lydia barely touched her food. Pritchard spoke too much. Mrs. Whitcomb watched them both with narrowed eyes. Miss Marple observed everything. At one point, Lydia excused herself abruptly, pressing a hand to her temple. "A headache," she murmured. Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the cabinet in the corridor. Later, when the household had retired, Miss Marple walked slowly past the study. The door was ajar. Inside, Alfred Pritchard sat at the desk, writing rapidly. He looked up, startled. "Miss Marple," he said. "Can I help you?" "Perhaps," she replied. "I was wondering, did you ever take headache powders yourself?" Pritchard stiffened. "Occasionally." "And did you ever prepare them for Charles?" she asked. "No," he said too quickly. "That was Lydia's habit." Miss Marple nodded pleasantly. "Of course." She wished him good night and continued on her way, her mind very clear now. The powder had been the key. But it was not the whole story. Someone had planned Charles Whitcomb's death carefully.
Someone had expected it to look like an accident, and someone else had helped, either knowingly or through convenient silence. At Hawthorne Manor, murder had not been an impulse. It had been a decision.
Chapter 3. Call to Action. Do you believe the poison was administered by one person, or was someone else involved? Share your theory below. Chapter 4. The Will That Changed Everything. If Hawthorne Manor had felt uneasy before, it now seemed positively alert, as though the house itself had become aware that its secrets were no longer safe. Miss Marple noticed the change immediately. Doors were closed more often. Conversations stopped abruptly when she entered a room. Even the servants, normally trained to unobtrusive perfection, could not quite disguise their nervousness. A murder investigation, even one politely referred to as an accident, had a way of unsettling established hierarchies. That morning, Alfred Pritchard requested a private meeting. They sat in the study, a room heavy with dark wood and darker intentions. Legal volumes lined the shelves, their spines worn smooth by years of consultation. On the desk lay several documents, neatly stacked, as though order might impose clarity. "I thought it best," Pritchard began, "to inform you of certain developments." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "I'm listening." "The will," he said. "Charles's will." "Yes," Miss Marple replied mildly. "You mentioned it before." Pritchard adjusted his spectacles. "It appears Charles intended to revise it, quite substantially." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows slightly. "Intended?" "Yes. The revised version was drafted, but never signed." "And the existing will?" she asked. "Leaves the bulk of the estate in trust," Pritchard said. "Managed by Mrs. Whitcomb during her lifetime." After that, matters become more complicated. "How so?" "Lydia would inherit a significant portion. Clara, a smaller allowance. The remainder would be distributed among various charitable interests." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "And the revised version?" Pritchard hesitated. "The revised version would have bypassed Mrs. Whitcomb entirely," he said at last. "Transferred immediate control to Charles himself, with provisions to remove Lydia from any direct inheritance." "That must have been unsettling," Miss Marple observed. "It would have been disastrous," Pritchard replied sharply. Then, catching himself, he softened his tone. "Financially, I mean." "Of course," Miss Marple said. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Lydia Whitcomb. She found her in the conservatory, seated rigidly among potted palms, staring out through the glass as rain traced thin lines down the panes. "I hear Charles had plans," Miss Marple said gently. Lydia's lips tightened. "Charles had many ideas, most of them impractical." "Did his ideas include revising his will?" Miss Marple asked. There it was, the slightest flicker of panic before Lydia recovered herself. "He mentioned it," she said coolly. "Nothing was decided." "But he intended to remove you from the inheritance," Miss Marple said softly. Lydia stood abruptly. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Miss Marple asked. "People do strange things when they believe they've been betrayed." Lydia turned away. "I loved my husband." Miss Marple watched her go, noting the stiffness in her shoulders, the speed of her retreat. Love, she reflected, was often a matter of definition. That evening, dinner was an exercise in restraint. Mrs. Whitcomb presided at the table, her expression severe. She spoke at length about estate duties and the inconvenience of delays. Clara remained quiet, her gaze shifting constantly between Lydia and Pritchard. Halfway through the meal, Mrs. Whitcomb addressed Pritchard sharply. "You assured me everything was in order." "I assured you," Pritchard replied, "that matters were manageable." "Manageable is not the same as secure," Mrs. Whitcomb snapped. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Interesting, she thought. Very interesting. Later, Miss Marple found Clara alone in the small library. "Charles trusted you," Miss Marple said without preamble. "Yes," Clara replied. "Perhaps too much." "He told you about the will?" Clara nodded slowly. "He said it would anger them, that they'd try to stop him." "Did he name anyone in particular?" "No," Clara said, "but he was frightened." "Frightened people sometimes take precautions," Miss Marple said. "Did Charles hide anything?" Clara hesitated, then reached into her pocket and produced a folded envelope. "He asked me to keep this," she said, "in case something happened." Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. Inside was a copy of the revised will, unsigned but unmistakable. Miss Marple returned it gently. "You were wise to keep this safe." As she retired for the night, Miss Marple reviewed the pattern forming before her. Charles Whitcomb had planned to change everything: control, money, power. His death restored the old order perfectly. Mrs. Whitcomb retained authority, Lydia stood to inherit, Alfred Pritchard maintained influence. Only Clara lost something: hope. And yet Clara had gained something else: knowledge. The will did not prove murder on its own, but it established motive with uncomfortable clarity. Too many people had something to lose. As Miss Marple extinguished her lamp, she felt the familiar certainty settle over her. This crime was not about passion. It was about preservation. And someone at Hawthorne Manor had been willing to kill to keep things exactly as they were. Call to action. Does the will point more strongly toward Lydia, Mrs. Whitcomb, or Alfred Pritchard? Tell me who you suspect and why. Chapter 5. A Lie Repeated Too Often. Miss Marple had long observed that lies, when repeated often enough, begin to sound like truth, even to those who tell them. At Hawthorne Manor, repetition had become a kind of refuge. Each member of the household clung to a version of events that suited them best, smoothing away any detail that threatened to disturb the fragile balance restored by Charles Whitcomb's death. But repetition, Miss Marple knew, also created patterns, and patterns could be examined. The opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. On the morning of the 5th day, Inspector Graves returned with renewed purpose. The sample of powder Miss Marple had quietly drawn his attention to had been tested. The results were not conclusive enough to satisfy a courtroom, but they were troubling. A compound consistent with cyanide derivatives, Graves admitted in a low voice as they spoke in the garden. Small quantity, enough to cause dizziness, confusion, possibly a fall. Possibly, Miss Marple agreed, or possibly something more deliberate. Graves exhaled slowly. I'll need more than suspicion. Of course, Miss Marple said. Suspicion is merely the beginning. Later that afternoon, she took advantage of the household's routine once more. Mrs. Whitcomb retired to her room for her customary rest. Lydia announced she would be writing letters. Alfred Pritchard shut himself away in the study. Clara remained in the drawing room, reading without turning a page. Miss Marple chose the study. Pritchard looked up sharply as she entered. Miss Marple. Mr. Pritchard,
she replied pleasantly. "I was hoping you might help me clarify something." "I'm rather busy," he said. "I won't take long." She seated herself without waiting for an invitation. "You've said repeatedly," she began, "that Charles was careless, impulsive,
prone to rushing into decisions. Pritchard stiffened. That was my impression. Curious, Miss Marple said gently, because everyone else describes him quite differently. Pritchard frowned. People remember the dead generously. Or accurately, Miss Marple countered. Clara tells me Charles was methodical, planned, cautious. She's young, Pritchard said dismissively. Romantic. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet, the revised will was carefully drafted, the changes deliberate, hardly the work of a reckless man. Pritchard's jaw tightened. Mr. Pritchard, Miss Marple continued, how many times have you prepared headache powders for someone? He blinked. What? In your capacity as secretary, Miss Marple said calmly. You fetch papers, books, medicines occasionally? No, he said quickly. That was Lydia's role. Always? Miss Marple asked. Yes. Without exception? Pritchard's silence was brief but unmistakable. That, Miss Marple said softly, is the danger of repetition. One begins to forget the truth. She rose and left him staring after her, unsettled. That evening Lydia approached Miss Marple herself. They met in the conservatory, twilight filtering through the glass. You've been asking questions, Lydia said coolly. I do ask questions, Miss Marple replied. It's a habit. You're implying things, Lydia continued, about my marriage, about the will. I imply nothing, Miss Marple said. I observe. Lydia laughed sharply. Charles wasn't the man you imagine. No, Miss Marple agreed. He was worse. He intended change. Lydia's composure cracked just for a moment. You don't understand, she said quietly. He would have ruined everything. Everything for whom? Miss Marple asked. Lydia looked away. Later that night, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the corridors. Outside the medicine cabinet, she paused. The door was closed, but the latch sat differently than before. Someone had opened it, recently. Inside, the headache powders were neatly arranged, all of them, except one. The same packet Miss Marple had examined earlier was gone. She did not touch the others. She did not alert anyone. She simply noted the absence. In the drawing room, she found Clara waiting. I thought you might come, Clara said quietly. You've noticed something, Miss Marple replied. Clara nodded. I saw Lydia leave the study earlier. She was carrying something small, wrapped in a handkerchief. Did you see where she went? The garden, Clara said. Toward the ash tree. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside. Beneath the ash tree, the earth had been disturbed, not deeply, hastily. Using a small stick, Miss Marple uncovered a crumpled paper packet, empty. She folded it carefully and returned inside. The lie that Charles had prepared his own medicine, that he had been careless, that nothing unusual had occurred, had been repeated too often. Now it was unraveling. Miss Marple returned to her room and sat quietly, hands folded. The powder was gone. Someone was afraid. And fear, Miss Marple reflected, was often more revealing than guilt. Chapter 5. Call to Action. Does Lydia's behavior convince you she's hiding something, or is she protecting someone else?
Share your theory below.
Chapter 6. The Night Garden Meeting. Miss Marple had always found that people were most honest when they believed themselves unobserved. In the open light of day, they performed their roles carefully, but at night, when shadows lengthened and consciences stirred, truth had a habit of slipping free. The ash tree stood at the far edge of the Hawthorne Manor gardens, its branches heavy and irregular, its roots breaking the soil in pale, twisted arcs. By daylight it appeared unremarkable. By night it took on a different character entirely. Miss Marple waited. She sat in the shadow of the yew hedge, shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, her small figure blending easily into the darkness. From her position she could see the path that wound from the house to the garden's far boundary. The moon hung low, veiled by thin cloud, offering just enough light to reveal movement. She did not have to wait long. A figure emerged from the conservatory doors. Lydia Whitcomb. She moved quickly, without a lantern, her steps purposeful rather than hesitant. She paused once, glancing back toward the house, then continued toward the ash tree. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Moments later, a second figure followed. Alfred Pritchard. He came from the study wing, taking care to keep to the deeper shadows. His usual composure was absent now. His shoulders were tense, his movements abrupt. When he reached the ash tree, Lydia was already there. Miss Marple could not hear their words clearly, but she did not need to. Their body language spoke volumes. Lydia gestured sharply. Pritchard shook his head. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. He looked away, then back again, his hands clenched. This was not the meeting of co-conspirators confident in success. This was an argument. At last, Pritchard reached into his pocket and produced something small. He handed it to Lydia reluctantly. She took it, glanced at it, and slipped it into her coat. Then, quite suddenly, the conversation ended. Lydia turned back toward the house. Pritchard remained a moment longer, staring down at the disturbed earth near the tree before smoothing it with his shoe and retreating in the opposite direction. Miss Marple remained still until both had disappeared. Then she rose. The ground beneath the ash tree had been disturbed twice now. First, to hide the empty powder packet. Second, more recently, to retrieve something else. Miss Marple knelt carefully, her knees protesting slightly, and brushed away the loose soil with her gloved hands. There it was, a small glass vial. Empty now, but unmistakable. Miss Marple straightened slowly, her heart steady, her mind clear. This was no longer a matter of inference. The powder had not simply vanished. It had been deliberately removed, hidden, exchanged, and not by one person alone. The next morning, the atmosphere in Hawthorne Manor was brittle. Breakfast passed in near silence. Lydia appeared pale and drawn, dark circles beneath her eyes. Pritchard arrived late, his usual neatness slightly undone. Mrs. Whitcomb noticed everything and said nothing. Always a dangerous combination. Miss Marple waited until Inspector Graves arrived mid-morning. She requested a walk. They strolled along the gravel path at the edge of the grounds, far from listening ears. Miss Marple produced the vial. Graves frowned. "Where did you find this?" "Near the ash tree," Miss Marple said, "after a private meeting last night." Graves exhaled slowly. "That's enough to justify formal questioning." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "but not enough to tell us why." Later that day, Graves questioned Lydia first. Miss Marple was not present, but she observed the aftermath. Lydia emerged pale and shaking, refusing tea, retreating immediately to her room. Pritchard was questioned next.
He did not retreat. He went directly to the study and locked the door. That evening, Miss Marple sought out Mrs. Whitcomb. They sat together in the drawing-room, the fire crackling softly. "You've known for some time, haven't you?" Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Whitcomb's eyes hardened. "Known what?" "That Charles intended to change the will."
"That it would cost you control. That Lydia and Mr. Pritchard were aligned." Mrs. Whitcomb's lips thinned. "I did what was necessary to protect my family." "Did that include protecting a murderer?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Whitcomb looked away. "I did not kill my nephew," she said sharply. "But I knew what would happen if he succeeded, and I chose not to interfere." Miss Marple nodded. Silence, she reflected, could be just as powerful as action. That night Miss Marple sat alone in her room, reviewing everything she had seen. The powder had been prepared deliberately. Lydia had access and motive. Pritchard had knowledge and opportunity. Mrs. Whitcomb had foreknowledge and silence. 3 strands of responsibility, but only one person had administered the poison, and Miss Marple was certain now who that was. The final step would require care, because at Hawthorne Manor, the truth was no longer hidden. It was waiting. Chapter 6. Call to Action. Do you think Lydia acted alone, or was Alfred Pritchard the true hand behind the poison? Share your theory before the final pieces fall into place. Chapter 7. Threads that begin to tighten. By the 7th day after Charles Whitcomb's death, Hawthorne Manor no longer pretended to be a place of mourning. It had become something else entirely, a house holding its breath. Miss Marple felt it the moment she stepped into the breakfast room. Conversation stopped too quickly. Chairs scraped with unnecessary sharpness. Cups rattled against saucers. Everyone was waiting for something, though none of them would have admitted it aloud. Inspector Graves arrived shortly after 9. This time, he did not remove his hat. "I'll be speaking to everyone again," he announced, "separately." Mrs. Whitcomb stiffened. Lydia stared fixedly at the tablecloth. Alfred Pritchard inclined his head, his expression carefully neutral. Clara looked up sharply, her eyes bright with a mixture of hope and fear. Miss Marple said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence, when used correctly, unsettled people far more effectively than accusation. The questioning began with Clara. She emerged from the study pale but composed. When Miss Marple later joined her in the garden, Clara spoke in a low, urgent voice. "He asked me about the will," she said, "about the envelope. I told him everything." "You did quite right," Miss Marple replied. "But now they know I kept it," Clara said. "They'll think I—" "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "They'll think you inconvenient. That is not the same thing." Next came Lydia. She was gone for nearly an hour. When she returned, she did not sit. She moved restlessly from window to window, her hands trembling despite her efforts to control them. Miss Marple watched her carefully. "Lydia," she said at last, "have you slept?" Lydia laughed sharply. "How could I?" "Of course," Miss Marple said. "Guilt is such a poor companion at night." Lydia's face drained of color. "You have no right." "I have every right," Miss Marple replied calmly, "because someone is dead." Lydia turned away, breathing quickly. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Like what?" But Lydia said nothing more. When Alfred Pritchard was summoned, the atmosphere shifted yet again. He entered the study confidently, closing the door behind him. The questioning lasted longer than any of the others. Voices rose. At one point, Inspector Graves's tone grew unmistakably sharp. When Pritchard finally emerged, his composure was gone. He avoided everyone's eyes and went directly to the side door, disappearing into the grounds. Miss Marple followed at a distance. She watched as he paced the gravel path, hands clenched, muttering to himself. At last he stopped near the old tool shed and leaned heavily against the wall, his shoulders sagging. Miss Marple approached quietly. "Pressure has a way of loosening things," she said gently. Pritchard flinched. "You enjoy this, don't you?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "I endure it." He laughed bitterly. Charles thought himself clever. Thought he could change everything. "And you thought he was wrong," Miss Marple said. "He would have ruined us," Pritchard snapped. "The estate, Mrs. Whitcomb, Lydia—" "And yourself," Miss Marple added. Pritchard's silence confirmed it. "You advised him against the new will," Miss Marple continued. "You failed, so you allowed someone else to act." "I didn't poison him," Pritchard said hoarsely, "but I knew what Lydia planned." "And you helped her," Miss Marple said, "by saying nothing, by removing the vial afterward." Pritchard covered his face. "I thought if the evidence disappeared, if it looked like an accident—" Miss Marple nodded. "One always believes one can control the consequences." That evening, Miss Marple requested that everyone gather in the drawing room after dinner. Mrs. Whitcomb protested. Lydia objected weakly. Inspector Graves agreed immediately. The fire burned low as they assembled. Miss Marple sat in her usual chair, knitting, resting idle in her lap. "I believe," she said quietly, "that Charles Whitcomb did not fall by accident." No one spoke. "He was poisoned," she continued. "Not enough to kill him outright, but enough to cause dizziness, confusion, and collapse." Lydia's breathing quickened. "The powder was prepared in advance," Miss Marple said. "Administered deliberately. The fall merely completed the plan." Mrs. Whitcomb stood abruptly. "You have no proof." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "I have patterns, and patterns are rarely mistaken." She turned to Lydia. "You gave Charles the powder," Miss Marple said. "You believed it would only frighten him, slow him, perhaps stop him from confronting you." Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know he would die." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly. "You didn't." She turned to Pritchard. "You knew," she said. "You helped afterward. You hid the evidence." Finally, she looked at Mrs. Whitcomb. "And you," Miss Marple said gently, "chose silence, because his death preserved your control." Inspector Graves stepped forward. "I think," he said, "we'll continue this conversation at the station." Lydia collapsed into a chair, sobbing. As the officers prepared to escort them away, Miss Marple felt the familiar heaviness settle over her. Justice, she knew, was rarely neat, but the truth, once spoken, had a way of reshaping everything, and Hawthorne Manor, at last, was no longer holding its breath. Chapter 7. Call to Action. Do you think Lydia's guilt excuses her actions, or does intention matter less than outcome? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 8. What the House Remembered. After the confrontation in the drawing room, Hawthorne Manor did not erupt into chaos as one might have expected. Instead, it settled into something quieter and far more unsettling. A house, Miss Marple reflected, often mirrored its inhabitants. When secrets were exposed, the walls did not tremble. They listened. Inspector Graves remained at the manor overnight, assigning a constable to each entrance.
Lydia Whitcomb was escorted to her room, pale and silent, while Alfred Pritchard was confined to the study under watch. Mrs. Whitcomb retired upstairs without protest, her dignity intact but brittle, like porcelain that had already cracked. Miss Marple sat alone in the small morning room, her knitting untouched. The case, she knew, was not yet finished. There were still gaps, small ones, but important.
And small gaps left unattended had a habit of widening in court. Just after midnight, Miss Marple rose and moved quietly through the corridors. She stopped outside Charles Whitcomb's former bedroom. The door creaked faintly as she entered. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating the room in pale silver. It looked much as it had before, too orderly, too clean. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly, deliberately. A man who feared for his future, who believed himself threatened, did not leave everything exactly where it belonged. She approached the writing desk. The drawers were locked, but only lightly. With a gentle twist of the key left in the cabinet nearby, Miss Marple opened the bottom drawer. Inside lay a thin leather notebook. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with observations, dates, names, small notations written in Charles Whitcomb's precise hand. Entries about estate accounts, about discrepancies, about Alfred Pritchard's creative interpretations of trust distributions. And then, near the end, something else. A single page folded inward. Miss Marple unfolded it. It was a note. "If anything happens to me, look to the garden accounts. The ash tree was never just a tree." Miss Marple closed the notebook slowly. So Charles had known, not only that he was in danger, but where the danger had been concealed. At dawn, Miss Marple requested that Inspector Graves walk with her through the grounds. The air was cold and still, the grass heavy with dew. They stopped beneath the ash tree, its roots pale and twisted as ever. "Charles knew something was hidden here," Miss Marple said. Graves frowned. "We've already searched this area." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but not thoroughly enough." She pointed toward the base of the tree, where the roots curved inward toward the trunk. "Men tend to dig," she said mildly. "Women often tuck things away." With a small trowel borrowed from the shed, Graves loosened the soil between the roots. Within moments, the metal edge struck something solid. They uncovered a shallow tin box, rusted but intact. Inside were documents, ledgers, receipts, and correspondence tying Alfred Pritchard directly to years of financial manipulation. Funds quietly diverted, accounts altered. The estate slowly bled dry, all under the guise of careful management. Graves let out a low whistle. "This would have destroyed him." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "which is why Charles had to be stopped." Back inside the manor, Alfred Pritchard was confronted with the evidence. He did not deny it. His confession came quickly then, almost with relief. He had been siphoning funds for years, believing himself indispensable. When Charles discovered the truth and announced his intention to expose it, Pritchard panicked. Lydia, already furious over the revised will, had been easy to influence. "I never meant for him to die," she said again, her voice hollow. "I just wanted time." "You wanted control," Miss Marple said gently. "Time was merely the excuse." Mrs. Whitcomb listened to it all without interruption. When it was over, she sank into a chair, suddenly old. "I built this house on silence," she said quietly, "and silence destroyed it." Later that afternoon, as police preparations continued, Miss Marple sat with Clara in the garden. "I thought everyone here was stronger than they were," Clara said softly. "They were," Miss Marple replied, "just not in the way that mattered." "And Charles?" Clara asked. "He trusted the wrong people," Miss Marple said, "but he left enough behind to be heard." As the day faded, Miss Marple took one last walk through Hawthorne Manor. The house felt different now, lighter. Truth, she reflected, did not repair damage, but it allowed things to settle honestly. One chapter remained, not of guilt, but of resolution. Chapter 8. Call to Action. Do you think Charles could have survived if he'd acted sooner, or was betrayal already inevitable? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 9. When the Truth Settles. Truth, Miss Marple had often observed, did not arrive with drama. It lingered instead, settling into corners, reshaping relationships, and forcing people to live with what they had tried so hard to avoid. Hawthorne Manor awoke the morning after Alfred Pritchard's confession to a kind of exhausted clarity. The police moved quietly through the house, cataloging documents, sealing rooms, speaking in low, professional tones. There were no raised voices now, no denials. The worst had already happened, and everyone knew it. Lydia Whitcomb was taken away shortly after breakfast. She did not resist. She walked between the officers with her head held high, though her eyes were hollow. As she passed Miss Marple in the hallway, she stopped briefly. "I didn't mean to kill him," Lydia said. "I only wanted him to stop." Miss Marple looked at her with gentle seriousness. "Wanting something badly enough," she said, "does not make it harmless." Lydia nodded once and continued on. Mrs. Whitcomb remained. She sat in the drawing room, hands folded, staring at the fireplace that had not been lit in days. When Miss Marple joined her, she did not look up. "I taught them silence," Mrs. Whitcomb said at last. "I taught them that appearances mattered more than truth." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly. "Many families do." "I thought control would protect us," Mrs. Whitcomb continued. "I was wrong." Miss Marple said nothing. There was nothing left to correct. Inspector Graves found Miss Marple later in the garden. "The Crown will likely argue conspiracy," he said, "against Pritchard especially. Lydia, it will depend on medical testimony." "And Mrs. Whitcomb?" Miss Marple asked. Graves sighed. "Morally complicit. Legally, harder to prove." "Justice," Miss Marple said, "is not always complete." "No," Graves agreed, "but it will do." That afternoon, Clara Whitcomb met Miss Marple by the ash tree one last time. "It looks different now," Clara said. "It always did," Miss Marple replied. "You simply see it clearly." "What will happen to the manor?" Clara asked. "The estate will be restructured," Miss Marple said, "under supervision, without secrecy." Clara nodded. "Charles would have wanted that." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "he would have." They walked together along the gravel path, the house looming quietly behind them. For the first time since her arrival, Miss Marple noticed that the windows were open. Air moved freely through the rooms. The house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. In the village, word spread quickly,
but differently than Miss Marple expected. There was sympathy, yes, shock, but also a sense of correction,
as though something long misaligned had finally been set straight. By evening, Miss Marple packed her bag. Inspector Graves stopped her at the door. "You could have been wrong," he said. "You had very little proof at first." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I had people." "That was enough." "It usually is," she replied. As the car carried her away from Hawthorne Manor, Miss Marple looked back once. The manor stood quiet in the fading light, neither grand nor broken, simply honest at last. But one thing remained, the question of consequence. Some would be punished by law, others by memory. Some by the knowledge that, when given the chance to act, they had chosen silence. And silence, Miss Marple reflected, was rarely forgiven by time. Call to action. Do you believe Mrs. Whitcomb bears as much responsibility as the others? Or does guilt require action? Share your thoughts below. Chapter 10. A clever deduction, quietly spoken. Miss Marple had always disliked farewells that were rushed. Truth, she believed, deserved time to settle, like dust after a long disturbance. Hawthorne Manor, though calmer now, still bore the weight of everything that had been revealed within its walls. The final morning dawned pale and cool. Miss Marple stood at the window of her guest room, watching mist drift slowly across the lawns. The ash tree loomed in the distance, its branches unmoving. It no longer felt menacing, simply tired. Downstairs, the house stirred. Inspector Graves had requested one final meeting before Miss Marple's departure. Not an interrogation this time, but a clarification. One last piece of the puzzle that required careful wording. They gathered in the drawing room. Mrs. Whitcomb sat upright, impeccably dressed, despite everything. Clara stood near the fireplace, her expression solemn but steady. Inspector Graves occupied the far chair, notebook closed for once. Miss Marple took her usual seat. "There's one thing I'd like made absolutely clear," Graves began. "For the record." He turned to Miss Marple. "You concluded the manner of death very early, before we had proof, before the powder was tested. Why?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "Because of the stairs," she said. Graves blinked. "The stairs?" "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. "They were too safe." She explained patiently. "Hawthorne Manor's staircase is broad, well carpeted, and evenly lit." Charles Whitcomb was cautious by nature and familiar with the house. A simple fall did not suit either the environment or the man. Graves nodded slowly. "And the vase?" he prompted. "Placed deliberately," Miss Marple said, "to explain the sound, to create a moment of chaos. People remember noise more than sequence." Mrs. Whitcomb shifted uncomfortably. "And the poison?" Graves asked. "That," Miss Marple said, "was the clever part. Not enough to kill, just enough to unsteady him." She paused. "A murderer who truly wishes to escape suspicion often relies on moderation. Excess invites questions." Silence settled over the room. Clara spoke then. "Charles suspected something was wrong. Why didn't he leave?" Miss Marple turned to her kindly. "Because he believed reason would prevail." "I thought control would save us," Mrs. Whitcomb said quietly. "I thought silence was strength." Miss Marple looked at her with gentle seriousness. "Silence is only strength when it protects the innocent." Mrs. Whitcomb nodded once, her composure finally cracking. The car door closed softly. As Miss Marple was driven away, she reflected not on the crime itself, but on the deduction that had solved it. There had been no single dramatic clue, no confession shouted in anger, only small observations, a powder folded incorrectly, a lie repeated too often, a staircase too safe for an accident. Clever deduction, Miss Marple knew, was rarely about brilliance. It was about patience. Hawthorne Manor faded into the distance, its story complete. And somewhere, in another quiet village, another truth waited patiently to be noticed.
Chapter 10. Call to Action. Which clue do you think was the most decisive in solving the mystery? The powder, the will, or the ash tree? Share your final thoughts below. And so, dear listener, the halls of Hawthorne Manor fall silent once more. The echoes of footsteps fade. The doors close gently, and the village of St. Mary Mead resumes its familiar rhythm. Tea poured, hedges trimmed, conversations conducted in careful, polite tones. Yet nothing is ever quite the same. A truth once uncovered cannot be forgotten, only accepted. And in this quiet English manor, it was not force or fear that brought justice, but observation, patience, and the courage to notice what others chose to ignore. Miss Marple leaves as she always does, without ceremony, without applause. She carries no trophies of her cleverness, only the quiet knowledge that another wrong has been set right. Not through drama, but through understanding. Perhaps that is her greatest lesson. That evil rarely arrives announcing itself. That danger often hides behind routine and respectability. And that the smallest details, the ones dismissed as trivial, are often the most revealing of all. Thank you for spending this time with Miss Marple, for listening closely, and for walking through this mystery from its first unsettling moment to its final quiet truth. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Which clue stayed with you the longest? Which moment made you stop and reconsider everything? And if you would like to return to St. Mary Mead or step into another mystery altogether, be sure to stay close. Because somewhere, in a place that looks perfectly ordinary, another secret is already waiting. Until next time, sleep well and listen carefully.